Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kasiah Ruddell. Thank you for joining me for my presentation. So I want to start off by asking you all to imagine or what comes to your mind when I say the word hula. So is it a curvaceous tanned Hawaiian woman who's making waves with her arms as she sways her hips, or maybe a tanned muscular Hawaiian man, maybe dancing with fire at a luau? So the hula is a traditional dance that communicates ancestral knowledge, and this important part of Hawaiian culture has almost been lost due to policies imposed on them, even as recent as 1997. This is when the state legislature tried to pass a law to prohibit the gathering of traditional hula dance materials. So instead of it being kept sacred within the Hawaiian culture, it's become a tourist industry commodity. And with the effects of colonialism on the Hawaiian culture in mind, the significance of my project, protecting ka mo'omeheu o Hawaii, a cultural resources risk assessment, is revealed. With the Hawaiian culture still in recovery from colonialism and the field of cultural resources still relatively new in Hawaii, protecting what is left regarding cultural resources is imperative. In this study, a cultural resources risk assessment was conducted to identify those cultural resources that are at most risk and to identify what poses the greatest danger to them. So today we'll go over data and study area, followed by methods, results, a short little discussion, and then conclusion. So instead of using all 8 Hawaiian islands or populated 8 Hawaiian islands, I chose to use Oahu. It is the most densely populated of all the islands and the one with the most industry. So these are my data layers. 9 of these are my variables that I used for my risk assessment. So data sources are City and County of Honolulu, the Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division, NOAA Office of Coastal Management, Hawaii State GIS Program, and then the US Census Bureau, the EPA Toxic Release Inventory, and then I used an SRTM digital elevation model for elevation and then a derived slope map, and those were from the USGS Earth Explorer. So in this analysis, a total of 2,858 cultural resources were evaluated for vulnerability. These cultural resources consist of 4 different categories. So that's the archaeological points, historic buildings, historic objects, and then finally historic structures. And this data was provided by the Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division. And then here you can see the 4 different categories and their distribution around the island. Okay, moving on to methods. So this is a basic flow chart depicting the steps taken in the risk assessment. Each cultural resource layer was overlaid or intersected with the risk variables and the coastal vulnerability index and the human threat index. This was to determine where they fell within each variable layer. And depending on this, each cultural resource was given a rank of 1, low risk, 2, moderate risk, or 3, high risk. And these ranks were then used to find the overall coastal vulnerability and human threat index scores. And then distance to coast was calculated separately from the coastal vulnerability index and the human threat index, and then ranked as another risk variable before being used in the final cultural resource vulnerability index. So this is the formula that I used for the coastal vulnerability index. It has 5 different variables, and those are elevation, slope, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and flood zones. And for each variable, cultural resources were given a rank of high, moderate, and low risk. So again, that's 3, 2, or 1. And these ranks were decided on using Hawaii state data and NOAA data on sea level rise, flooding, and coastal erosion. Much of Oahu is at or just above sea level, so many areas are subjected to flooding and at risk of sea level rise in the very near future. In fact, according to the state of Hawaii, Hawaii's climate change portal, sea level has been measured at 10 inches since 1950 and is expected to rise about 1 inch every 4 years. And they have also lost 13 miles of beaches due to coastal erosion. 10% were on Oahu, and currently 70% of Hawaii beaches are at risk of coastal erosion. So once each variable was ranked, this formula was used to determine the overall coastal vulnerability index score. And because Oahu is a small island subject to many coastal vulnerabilities, each variable in this formula was weighted the same, the 0.20 that you see in front of each variable. There we go. So here's an example of results from the Coastal Vulnerability Index using archaeological points. So that's one of the 4 cultural resource layers. As you will see in some of the other upcoming images, this more traditional cartographic visualization is a little difficult to comprehend just because of the density of cultural resources across the island. So later we're going to look at a dashboard app that I created to better visualize the data. So moving on to the Human Threat Index. This formula only used 3 variables instead of 5 like the Coastal Vulnerability Index. So that's state land use districts, population density, and air pollution. Again, for each variable, cultural resources were given a rank of high, moderate, or low risk. And then state designated land use districts consisted of urban, agricultural, rural, and conservation. Population density was calculated by taking the number of people per census tract and dividing it by census tract land area. And then for air pollution, I did something a little different. I took distance to air polluting facility and density of air pollution output per census tract into account in deciding ranking. And then for weighting, I chose to give state land use districts and population density the weight of 0.35 more than the air pollution, which is 0.30, just because I feel that the population density and the state land use district are also indicative of how much air pollution is going to be in an area. So here is an example, again, archaeological points of the cultural resources ranked for Human Threat Index. And again, we'll better visualize them later in my dashboard app. Okay, for distance to coast, this was calculated separately from the Coastal Vulnerability Index and Human Threat Index. Proximity to the coastline is a major factor when determining risk to cultural resources on Oahu, just because many of them do lie near the coast and are at risk of coastal factors like sea level rise. But in addition to this, a lot of heavily populated areas are close to the coast. So I didn't want to isolate distance to coast in either of the 2 indices. I decided to use it as a 3rd variable in the overall formula. So the distance to coast was calculated using the NEAR tool in ArcGIS. After calculating this distance, cultural resources were ranked according to how close to the coast they are. So if they were less than 500 meters, they were ranked as high risk. Between 500 and 1,000 meters, they were ranked as moderate risk. And then finally, if they were greater than 1,000 meters from the coast, they were ranked as low risk. And here is the overall Cultural Resources Vulnerability Index. And as you can see, it's distance to coast plus CVI score plus HTI score. For archaeological points, I chose to give the distance to coast 0.35 weight, and then a weight of 0.35 for Coastal Vulnerability Index score, and then 0.30 for the Human Threat score. And then for the other 3 resources, historic objects, buildings, and structures, I chose to change the weighting system a little bit. So distance to coast did stay the same, 0.35, and then CVI score was 0.25 and HTI score is 0.40. I chose to do this because most archaeological points are located right along the coast, putting them at higher risk of coastal factors, whereas many of the other cultural resources while they are still close to the coast, they are in really densely populated areas, putting them at higher risk of harmful human exposure. So results of the Cultural Resources Vulnerability Index. For archaeological points, 99 or 5.84% of them are at high risk, 857 or 50.59 are at moderate risk, and 738 or 43.57% are at low risk. And then moving on to historic buildings, 30 or 2.96% of historic buildings are at high risk, 904 or 89.06% are at moderate risk, and 81 or 7.98% are at low risk. Historic objects. I only had access to 6 of the historic objects on island. So 1 or 16.67% of historic objects are at high risk, whereas 5 or 83.33% are at moderate risk, and then none of them were at low risk. And then finally, for historic structures, 27 or 20.30% of historic structures are at high risk, 62 or 46.62% are at moderate risk, and 44 or 33.08% are at low risk. However, it is really difficult to look at that map and really get a good idea of each cultural resource and its risk level. So I did make a dashboard application, and I'm going to go ahead and share that. So this is my dashboard application. I do have a description here. It describes the Cultural Resource Vulnerability Index, and then it describes the different factors I use, so distance, and then the Coastal Vulnerability Index, as well as the Human Threat Index. And then it describes the different risk levels, so 1 low risk, 2 moderate risk, and 3 high risk. Towards the right, there is a legend for each of the different cultural resource categories, and then the colors corresponding to the risk level. And then if you look at the bottom of the right screen, so due to the number of cultural resources, the icons for each category do cluster when zoomed out. So in order to better visualize the individual cultural resources, you have to zoom in. But on the legend, it does have a little bit of a cluster legend, so that you can get an idea of what the sizes of the clusters mean. If you click on a cluster, it does give you a cluster summary. So this one represents 479 features, and the predominant value of these features for the CRVI score is 2, so moderate risk. And if you zoom in, you zoom into, we'll go to Iolani Palace. So this was the monarchy's palace in Honolulu. And if you click on the individual icon, you'll see the name of the cultural resource, what type of cultural resource it is, the distance to coast, and then the 3 different scores. So this one is at moderate risk. And then towards the left of the screen, I do have 3 different sections for pie charts. That way you can better visualize the statistics I was spouting off to you for each of the different scores. So we can go through each of the different category cultural resource categories, and the colors do correspond with the icon colors. Go back to PowerPoint. So this study provides a quantitative method for estimating the vulnerability of cultural resource sites on Oahu. The 4 different categories of cultural resources are, they follow different distributions across the island. So many of the archaeological sites are concentrated along the coast, whereas many of the historic buildings occur in the heart of Honolulu. Due to this, I don't think it's enough to only examine the cultural resource vulnerability index scores. I think you should look at both the CVI scores and the HTA scores individually. For example, when you look at which ones are at high risk, only 157 or 5.49% in the overall CRVI scores were at high risk, whereas Coastal Vulnerability Index 43 or 1.5% of all of the cultural resources were at high risk. and then human threat index 951 or 33% were at high risk. So when broken down into these two different indices, you can see that there's a little bit of difference between the coastal vulnerability and human threat. Due to this, I believe that most of the cultural resources have a higher risk of human threat than coastal vulnerabilities. And then, so the index is meant to be used as a tool in the ongoing protection and preservation of Oahu's cultural heritage. And it's not meant to be an end in itself. This isn't just one and done cultural resource risk assessment. There is no efficiency in going around to every single cultural resource on island. Again, there's over 2,858 of them, and conducting individual assessments to calculate their vulnerability. I hope that this can streamline field studies and that the most vulnerable cultural resources can be addressed first. And with increased threats from climate change and humans, there stands a chance that cultural heritage sites could be lost forever. And hopefully this tool can be used to help empower Hawaiians in deciding how to conduct cultural heritage management. Cultural resources are not renewable, and if lost, part of the Hawaiian past experience is lost with them. Mahalo nui for joining me for my presentation. Does anybody have any questions?